Thank you everybody for joining us today. And in today's session, we're going to start with, we're going to have a bit more of a discussion-based session today. But before we get started with all of that, we just kind of want to have a little bit of a reflection of where we've come from and what we've been doing over the last 3 weeks. So today's session is all about the role of engineers within the development sector. We'll kind of talk about that shortly, but before we kind of kick off, just do a quick round of introductions and just to remind you, for those of you this is your first session, a little reminder of who we all are. So, hello, I'm Kerry, I'm the engagement coordinator. I'm going to be taking you through this first section of today's session. We've also got Emma with us today. Give us a little wave, thank you, Emma. And a new face with us today's session. We've got Ruth Taylor who's joining us. So Ruth has spent the last 11 years working in the voluntary sector from a range of kind of social and environmental causes, predominantly in the campaigning space, and she specialises in shifting the underlying narratives needed to sustain long-lasting and structural change. So we've invited Ruth to help us through this session today, and I will be handing the reins over to Ruth shortly. But before we talk about the development sector and the role of engineers within the development sector, we want to have a little reflection on where we've come from, because this is our third week of building community leaders. And over the last 3 weeks, we've been coming together to explore your role within the Engineers Without Borders UK movement. We've talked about the impact that you can make within the activities you do, whether that be within engineering education or how you're leading your chapter at your university. And we've also started to talk about how you can continue using these skills to impact throughout your career. So, you know, the present day, what you're doing, but also what we can do in the future. We started off, if you can remember, 3 weeks ago, looking at globally responsible engineering, how engineers have always played a role in human development and how we've always had an impact on the planet. We've kind of talked about how those impacts have been happening, how it's no longer sustainable. It's quite a almost matter of fact these days, but the lifestyles and the ways we operate as human beings is no longer sustainable on our planet. And we talked about the need for change, so what that kind of change could be. And we talked about how we need to refocus engineering and the mindset and our skill set to ensure that engineering continues to create innovations, but most essentially is starting to serve all people around the planet better than ever before. And we spent a lot of time talking about what does that mean for individuals, but also what does that mean in the types of activities that you get involved with in your university. And we started to touch on the impact that we want to see at our own university. So if you can remember back to about 2 weeks ago, we invited you to share what you wanted to see changed at your university, whether that be within the curriculum or whether that be in the kind of activities that you do outside of the curriculum. And we started talking about the different ways we want to see change and how we can actually start making those changes happen at the universities that we work within. And we've been hearing lots of different ideas on what we want to see. One of the main kind of themes that have come out is that we want to see globally responsible engineering embedded in throughout curriculum. So not just being a module here or there, a little element that you speak about when it comes up, but actually embedding it throughout all of our teaching and activities. And we heard from some of the students that are currently studying engineering and how they see their courses at the moment and how they see some of the gaps in it. And we've had some challenges from them to improve what we're doing, but also very much encouragement from our student chapters that some of the activities that they're doing in the extracurriculum spaces are helping to see the impacts that we want to have within the university space. So the other thing that we've been doing outside of this kind of big thinking, wide concepts and big challenges, we've also been looking at the specific skills and nitty-gritty bits that we need to know for the year ahead. So the activities that you're running, whether it be a design challenge within the curriculum, whether it be a chapter activity, we've started to look at the different skills that we need for the coming year. We started to unpick some of the challenges that we're going to have, the interesting challenges that we'll have this year. So kind of starting to talk about how we can move things into this virtual space, how we can recreate and redesign some of the activities that we're doing. We've heard some really great ideas from everybody about how they're planning to do this year. And one of the things that we've discussed is, yes, there are absolutely going to be different challenges in the coming year, but we've also got an amazing set of opportunities that we didn't perhaps consider last year. And one of those big opportunities is being able to do things like this, come together and collaborate and share ideas as we go. So one of the things that we've said is that we want to share the thing that both the successes in the ways that we're delivering activities, but also the challenges, so we can learn from each other and continue to do that. And that's what we're going to start talking about in our sessions on Thursday, is how do we continue doing things like this, coming together and continue supporting each other throughout the next few months, when we're all having to go back to university and work out teaching in the virtual space, running activities in the virtual space. What does that really mean? We've learned a lot of practical skills, but in the next few weeks, you guys are going to have to start using those skills and trialing it in a new way. So we'll spend a bit of time on Thursday unpicking how do we do that, how do we continue to be in touch and continue to evolve and develop together. So that's what we've got happening in the rest of this week. But today, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to focus on the role of engineers in the development sector. And that's exactly why we've invited Ruth to come along and join us for today's session, because this is quite a tricky subject. It's quite a dynamic subject. It's a evolving subject. So we invited Ruth to come along and help us through this journey, through this discussion. So before I hand over to Ruth, I said earlier that this is going to be a little bit more of an interactive discussion-based subject. So to get us into that mindset, I'd like everybody to turn their cameras on if you can, because we're going to do a little bit of a warm-up exercise. For some of you, we've had a lovely bank holiday weekend, which means we've had 3 days of not sitting at a computer. Perhaps we've forgotten how to use our brains over the last 3 days. So we're going to do a little bit of a stretching exercise just to get us in that mindset. So we're going to start off with the most important muscle in our body, our neck. Just doing a little bit of back and forth with the neck. So just go to the left. I'm just going to move it over slowly to the right. Excellent. I'm going to move it down a little bit. Beautiful. I'm just going to roll it back around. Amazing. And then I want you to all stretch up really high and try and touch the ceiling. Just get our bodies moving. Nice big stretch. Amazing. Let's just stretch out our arm. Maybe give your fingers a little whirl there. Move over to the other side. Again, give your little fingers a little stretch. Amazing. Should we go over a little bit of, get that hips moving. Excellent. And then the other way. Beautiful. And then one of the most important features when we're doing a lot of typing and a lot of writing at our desk, let's just get those fingers moving around, get those wrists whirling, a bit of stretching there. Beautiful. Excellent. Does that feel better, guys? Are we feeling a little bit more flexible, ready to kick off today's session? Excellent. So I'm going to hand it over to Ruth, who's going to introduce what we're going to be doing today.
Great. Thank you so much. I enjoyed that stretching, realised how little I have moved since 9 o'clock this morning. Right, bear with me 1 second, guys. I'm just going to share my screen. Awesome. Hopefully everybody can see that. Please drop a message in the chat box if nothing is coming up for you. So, hello. As Kerry said, my name's Ruth. I've been a friend of Engineers Without Borders for, God, probably about 7 or so years now. And I'm really delighted to be able to join you all today. Just to give you a little bit of background, I guess, as to who I am and what I work on. So I've worked in predominantly the international development space, but sometimes social justice and environmental justice more broadly, for about 10 or 11 years now. I mainly focus on campaigning, as Kerry said, and specifically public engagement. So how do we get members of the predominantly UK public to care about the stuff that's going on in the world, both social and environmental, and take action. So a lot of my work has stemmed around questions of sort of injustice and how do you motivate people to think and feel and act differently on the causes that you know, and there are so many that we need to be caring about in the world. So currently I split my time 3 days a week. I work for the Common Cause Foundation, who are an organisation that work with a bunch of research that's come out of social psychology about values and what people value. So I lead our learning and communications work there, which a lot of the time is thinking about what underlying foundations or underlying narratives do we have in the world, in individual countries as well as across the world globally, and how do they help sort of strengthen people's engagement with social and environmental causes. So I do that 3 days a week, and then the other 2 days a week I'm a social change consultant, so I work with a variety of different organisations, both social and environmental, on helping them strengthen their campaigning and their sort of public engagement work. So I like to work in that way, really, because you get the benefit of working across different causes with different organisations who all work in really, really different ways. So that's a little bit about me, and I guess I have known Engineers Without Borders for a while. A lot of my work, and I still continue to do this work, but not to the same capacity anymore, is around strengthening the international volunteering sector. So, you know, 10 years ago or so, there was lots of debate about whether international volunteering is a good thing, is it a bad thing, is it ethical? And I was very engaged in those conversations and supporting organisations to think about how they could strengthen their programmes. So that's how my relationship with Engineers Without Borders came along. And although we're not going to be looking specifically at international volunteering today, there's still an awful lot of overlap, which I'm sure you'll spot as we go through. So that's a kind of brief introduction to me and who I am. As for today, so we're going to be looking at some of the kind of ethical implications that exist around the international development sector. Now this, you know, you could do a month-long course on that. It's, you know, packed with various debates, conversations, dialogues that are happening, need to be happening. So today is just a kind of quick skim. We're going to be looking at, we're going to orientate ourselves in sort of where international development has come from, because that in and of itself is potentially quite controversial. We'll look at some of the, well, I'm going to pick out two of the kind of key ethical considerations in international development work at the moment. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time about, you know, what does it mean for me as an individual to be trying to make positive change, be it societal or environmental. Before we think a little bit about, you know, how does this relate, how can this feed back to your activism at university. So you should be able to see a statement on your screens that says no design work is ethically neutral. From what I've heard about what you've been up to so far, it sounds like that is not going to be a surprise to anybody. Can I invite people to either unmute themselves or write in the chat box what you think I mean by that statement? So no design work is ethically neutral. Any ideas? Thank you, Helen. There's always going to be someone affected by your ideas. Absolutely. Yeah. You're either helping the world or hindering it. Oh, a law which I'm definitely not familiar with, but that sounds very exciting. I'm sure you're correct. Absolutely. So what I mean when I'm saying that no design work is ethically neutral is that it's impossible to design anything without there being ethical implications of one way or another. So, you know, we've got kind of fundamental questions that we need to be asking about who is designing what, for whom or with whom, what values are being assumed in your design. So this is something I work on a lot with designers in my work with Common Cause Foundation, is what values are kind of underpinning particular designs. Are they intrinsic values that strengthen pro-environmental and pro-social behaviours, or are they extrinsic? Are we strengthening values of wealth or social power, etc.? You know, in our design work, are we making assumptions about what other people want or what other people need? And I guess who's in the position of power in terms of making decisions? Is it individuals with lived experience? Is it those who have financial influence over the project? Is it those with decision-making powers? And the list goes on and on. But that's kind of roughly what I mean. And in terms of an international context, I would argue that this kind of potentially becomes even more complex, even more complicated. And it's not necessarily because your design work is substantially different, even though it could be. It's more to do with the fact that the surrounding kind of political, social, cultural, or economic environment that you're working in is different. And so, you know, you may be very familiar with a particular environment, depending on where you've grown up, where you live currently, where you have kind of experience. But if you are designing in a country very different to your own, and that can be anywhere, that could be, you know, the US, or it could be Bhutan, or wherever it might be, that might be very different. And so this question of how you design in an ethical manner, I believe, becomes a bit more complicated. So a quick history lesson on international development. I apologise if anyone's doing international development at university or has done a module in that, because you might be familiar with this content. Anybody recognise this very dapper gentleman? Feel free to unmute or to type in the chat box. No, not sure. That's all right. I wouldn't expect you to. So this is a chap called Henry Dunant. He was the co-founder of the International Red Cross. So Dunant was a Swiss businessman, and he witnessed the aftermath of the Battle of I believe it's pronounced Solferino, which is a town currently in modern day Italy. But he witnessed the aftermath of this battle, which was in 1859. He went to the town on business and saw the sort of the effects that this war had on the population. And he sort of was involved in the immediate aid efforts to alleviate the suffering of individuals. So he was really sort of shocked. There you know, the wounded were still lying in fields. There were dead bodies everywhere, and he wanted to make sure that those who were suffering were able to receive aid. So kind of off the back of this, I guess, he founded the International Red Cross. Whose kind of founding principles was this list that you can see on your screen. So it was about humanity and about, sorry, I have the loudest ice cream van in the world going past my house. Apologies for that. So it was based on humanity, the idea that all people matter. Impartiality, so quite often the International Red Cross was intervening in situations of war, and they gave aid regardless of what side the soldiers were on, so they were impartial. It was based on neutrality. They themselves did not take a political stance. They weren't advocating for or against a particular side. Likewise, they were independent. They weren't taking financial aid. At the beginning, it was a voluntary service. And it was about unity, about the kind of belief that that people need to come together to be able to prosper. So these were the underlying principles of International Red Cross. And as the first kind of humanitarian organisation, these have been the principles really that have been adopted by the majority of kind of INGOs that are working or have been working in the development space. Now, these principles stem from quite often from religious belief. So Dunant himself was a really devout man, very religious. And lots of scholars that have worked in the history of international development have identified that much of our work stems from two religious principles. So you have agape, which is the bottom word written in, I believe that's ancient Greek. You might have to check, which is the idea of kind of unconditional love and charity for your fellow human being. And you've got the idea of zakat, which is the third pillar of Islam. Again, the idea that you are kind of mandated to give a proportion of your earnings every year to charitable causes. So these ideas have really kind of founded international development up to the present day. So we still have organisations that are very securely sort of founded in religious belief. So you've got, Islamic Relief, you've got Christian Aid, the kind of obvious organisations, but you also have a swathe of organisations, although they don't proclaim a kind of religious stance today, were founded out of religious belief. So Oxfam, Amnesty, Save the Children, VSO, etc. The list goes on. It's actually more unusual for an organisation to have been founded out of a secular belief than the other way around. Now, for some, this is a relatively neutral fact. It doesn't necessarily have any kind of implication for the work that's being done. But for others, the kind of accusation that humanitarian work or development work is founded in a belief, in a desire to sort of evangelize a particular religious view, means that it's very difficult for an organization to claim to truly be universal. So critics of development work might say that it's a veil for kind of continuing colonialism or imperialism, and that it covers up exploitation. Now, we could go on to a huge kind of ethical debate on what this means for international organisations. I'm not going to do that today, but I wanted to highlight that the sector of international development in and of itself is sort of based, its very foundation is in a fairly controversial ethical issue. So, two of the biggest ethical debates surrounding development work today. So these aren't the sort of numerous and huge challenges that the sector faces. For example, how the sector is working within the current global pandemic and what the effects of the global pandemic will be on its work for over the next couple of years, decades. I'm not referring to things like the fact that the UK's Department for International Development, DFID, is going to be no more as of the end of today. I'm not referring to things like that or kind of massive changes in funding from big players like the US or Australia. I'm referring in much more to sort of two larger kind of ethical debates. So one of them being the racial power dynamics that exist within the international development sector. And this, I would say, is something which has always been a topic of great importance, but I would say probably at the moment, due to recent events in the US in particular, that have sparked mass protests around the Black Lives Matter movement, has been kind of even more brought to the fore. So if existing in the international development sector at the moment, this conversation is everywhere, and as it should be. So yeah, so for many people, myself included, I would say that the development sector has had a long, painful and unresolved sort of history of racism within its work. So the quote that you can see in front of you by Angela Bruce Rayburn, who is Director of Advocacy at a large African health organisation, she's talking about how, you know, the very work of the development sector, the aid sector, sort of stems from a kind of racist assumption that that white societies are able to determine and then provide to solve issues that other countries, predominantly black and brown countries, are able to that they are experiencing. For a long time, INGOs have been criticised for perpetuating the power dynamics of colonialisation. So although colonialism isn't operating in the same way that it was in our not so recent history, for many, international development as a practice is sort of furthering the power dynamics that existed at that time, which is very much the kind of notion that you have a problem in which we are able to solve. So I'm not necessarily talking about inclusion and diversity here, even though that is a like a standalone large problem for INGOs. Still, the majority of their staff are white, Western educated, and so there is a monopoly, I guess, on what is considered knowledge and best practice within INGOs. But I'm meaning, by referring to racial power dynamics here, I'm talking about kind of larger questions, I guess, about who gets to decide what good development looks like, who gets to decide what justice looks like. Is it those with lived experience of particular social or environmental issues, or is it those who basically have the money to put to particular solutions? So a key way that this power dynamic is witnessed, I guess, sometimes on an almost unconscious basis, is through the language that we use in international development. So I'm going to share with you a link. I need to stop sharing my screen to be able to do it. I'm going to share with you a link to a Google Doc, and I would love it if you could open that Google Doc. It should be set so the sharing settings are open to everybody. I'd love you to have a look, and on that Google Doc you're going to see some words listed. These are words that we use an awful lot in the international development sector to sort of describe the stuff that we're up to. I'd really love it if you could have a look at that list on the table and write down some of the issues that you think might be indicated by the use of these words, and have a go at suggesting an alternative. I hope people have been able to open that Google Doc. Let me know. If not, I've just popped it in the chat box. Have people been able to open that link? Yeah, great. Please feel free to jot your thoughts directly into the table. So why might this word be problematic, and what could a good replacement word be? There's no right or wrong answers with this. It's just an opportunity to discuss the kind of common language that we use often in international development, and how this might further, you know, often very unconsciously, those racial power dynamics that we were just discussing. And I'm just having a quick look at the chat. Amy, you said, is this the same thing as what is referred to as the white saviour image that's associated with political issues and protesting? Yes, absolutely. It's a very common thread. The idea that those who work in international development, I guess, that criticism of being a white saviour is very common, and sometimes I would say is very applicable. So this idea of all you need is good intentions to solve like a very complex social problem in a country that, you know, you don't speak the language and you don't necessarily have any experience yourself, just by the kind of fact that you're white, or that you're Western educated. Sorry, I have this ice cream van again. It's haunting me today. This idea that just because of the nature of who you are makes you able to solve problems which citizens of that country, that nation, have not been able to do themselves, is a big criticism when it comes to international development. And I think sometimes in some projects, some organisations, is a very apt criticism. I can't see people editing the Google document. I don't know whether...
Definitely happening, Ruth. On the link that I've got, I can see it.
Oh, it's okay. It just needed to refresh itself. It's fine. Thank you. I think my laptop's just still recovering from the bank holiday. Brilliant. Okay, so beneficiary suggests charity reliant on outside influences, seems patronising. Absolutely. I think the term beneficiary makes a big assumption that all international development programs, regardless of whether it's engineering or otherwise, is going to have benefit. That someone is going to benefit from the work that's happening is sort of an underlying assumption within the word beneficiary. What could a good replacement word be? Partner, absolutely. Foreign aid, othering, aid which is to come from somewhere else, belittles domestic aid. Yeah, all of that. There's also a ton of research in the UK. I couldn't speak for other countries on this, I'm afraid, but there is a ton of research in the UK that shows that the use of foreign instead of development aid means that the UK public are less likely to support. So if you say foreign aid, the UK public seem to switch off, don't necessarily want to help. Whereas if you say development aid, it's understood in a different way, and the UK public are likely to engage. And I think that is wrapped up in our very dangerous rhetoric that we have here around immigration. The idea that if you are foreign, you are you're not British, you're from somewhere else, you can't be related to in the same way. There is a distance that is then placed between the person you are messaging to and the communities in which you are conducting development work alongside. Foreign aid, available resources, investment, world investment. Yeah. I would assume that investment as a word probably depends on which sort of audience you're talking to. It's obviously a very kind of economic term. Oh, the field, one of my worst words. Suggests it's in the middle of nowhere, absolutely. Isolates other fields, suggests a lack of collaboration. Similar to conflict terminology, that's a really good point, yeah. I completely agree. I think the field is it's a very outdated term. It's still very prevalent across a lot of the international development sector, but sort of, at least in my mind, sets up this idea of kind of city life, which is very kind of progressive and everything's glass and it's very very developed and sort of focused on wealth and success, and that's kind of in comparison to this idea of a literal field which is sort of empty and rural and there's not much happening there. And yes, I really agree with the point about the sort of similarity to conflict terminology. It feels there's quite a lot of parallels with the way the army talk, things like that, which is a very weird parallel. Development should not be speaking about the sort of season in which they're working as if going to war with those communities. Name of the country and town, be specific, absolutely. Local communities does get used an awful lot, and I think that can, it's not as bad as the field. It can sort of have similar kind of implications, I guess. The idea that if something is local, it is not national, it's kind of less developed, it's further behind. Being specific wherever possible definitely is the way to go. Empowerment. So I guess this is probably the most controversial term on this list as to whether it should be used or not. Suggest that Western ideals are the only empowering ones. Yep. Often isn't actually used in the context of power or independence. Yep. Suggest someone else is doing the empowering, the person cannot do themselves. Absolutely. Yeah. There's an immediate assumption that they are not empowered. And that there's no possibility of an exchange of ideas or an exchange of this possibility for dialogue. That kind of gets eradicated by the idea that you are going in to empower still puts you in a position of power to be able to be giving power away, as it were. Enabling, involvement, engagement, capacity building. Yep. All of those words are used. To be honest, I've just decided to say it as it is, and it's usually a training program. So I tend to just use training now when I'm talking about empowerment. I think as long as you can talk about how, where that training program has come from, ideally you're working in such a way where that education piece, that training piece has been designed alongside, experts within the community that you're working alongside. It doesn't tend to have the same sort of connotations. And then the last one, third world and developing countries, implication of hierarchy, superiority, absolutely implies that these countries are in their natural state, hasn't been caused by political or economic dynamics, absolutely. Economic development is not the only type or measure of development, 100%, those are really strong answers. Yes, the idea that, I think it's rare nowadays that you hear the term third world in the sort of international development sector. You might hear it, elsewhere, and it is a term that's used a lot. And most people don't know where that term comes from, but it does have a long kind of political, historical kind of foundation. I think developing countries is still used fairly widely, but yeah, still has this sense that there is a group of countries that's not quite at the level of the West, but is on its way. The idea that all countries should be seeking to develop in the way that the UK, etc., has followed that sort of historical arc is very seeped in sort of superior thinking. Suggestions of what words to use instead: use the name of the place in question. Low middle income countries, at-risk regions, most prone societies, absolutely, yeah, spot on. Wherever possible, just use the name of the country and or kind of region of those countries. Surprising how much of international development terminology is sort of excess that you really don't need, and that you can, wherever possible, be specific, and you're going to avoid a lot of these problems. Thank you very much. I think those answers were really strong. So that was my first ethical issue. My second one that I wanted to share with you is the small issue of climate change. So I'd say that this is a topic that is I was going to say heating up, which it would be a horrendous phrase, but it probably is within international development. So I'd say that when thinking about climate change, there's sort of two strands of this that when thinking about development, which are really important. So one is the obvious one, which is the development sector, at least probably up until this year, has been really reliant on flying thousands of people around the world to do its work. So there's the kind of carbon footprint of the international development sector is absolutely huge. So I'm not just referring to things like the work itself, flying engineers out to certain countries to consult or project manage or whatever. It's also the hundreds of conferences that take place in the international development sector. It's unbelievable. Anywhere from the big conferences, anywhere from 1,000 delegates to 6,000 delegates are flying to various conferences, and to try to be international, those are held in different countries throughout the year. So and there has been a lot of campaigning work done kind of within the international development sector, sort of internally, to get those conferences to measure their carbon footprint, to understand exactly what sort of implication they, holding that conference in a physical way has on the environment. So that's the first way. And then the second way, which is demonstrated by this quote by Jason Hickel, who's a very prominent international development thinker, is talking about how actually the very process of development is furthering climate change, because it's all about development, but in a sort of industrial sense. So in that kind of idea of industrial growth, it's about countries being able to increase their GDP, so that they are able to move up from a lower income country to a middle income country, etc. And a lot of that is based on extraction, production, consumption, as Jason Hickel says. So I don't have the answers to these problems, but they're two very prominent ethical debates within international development, which I think a lot of the time when individuals working currently in the sector, not those who are hoping to go into it or are thinking about how their skill set can play a part, don't tend to receive many opportunities to consider these kind of very large ethical debates. Sorry, I've just lost my notes. Yeah, okay. So what is my role in making change happen? Again, we could spend months and months looking into this, but we have a short amount of time together today, so I'm going to try and whiz us through and introduce you to this framework, which is called the iceberg model. It's a way of trying to understand the underlying system at play when you're looking at any particular social or environmental problem. As a campaigner, I find this really useful for thinking about how you design a change process. How do you try to influence a change on a particular policy, etc. But also, I think in terms of trying to understand the various interventions that can happen around a problem, and how I, as an individual, given my culture, where I'm from, what my skill set is, etc., I can try to think where I best sit in that change process. So I'll quickly run you through the model so you can understand it in more detail if you haven't if you've never seen it before, and then we'll have a go at kind of filling it out together. So the whole idea is based on the an iceberg, where you are supposed to only be able to see about 10% of an iceberg above water, and the rest of it is submerged. So it's not as clear, you don't necessarily know it's there, etc. So with the iceberg model, you can tell that there's like a very clear separation between what's below sea level and what's above sea level. And what's above sea level is this section called events, and this is what the world perceives. So it's, if you were thinking about a social environmental problem, it's like the proof that that social environmental problem exists. Patterns and trends is sort of what's causing this event. It's starting to think a bit deeper and looking at whether similar events are happening over a set period of time. Being able to spot a trend helps us to be able to sort of forecast for it, and, you know, where possible, stop it before it happens. The next level, sorry, just move my slide. The next layer down is structures. So when we look below the level of patterns, we might be able to identify that those patterns are being upheld by a particular structure. So that could be an organisation, an institution, sort of structure in a very obvious sense, but it could be kind of ways of thinking, ways of being in a cultural sense that sort of sustain particular trends. This might become clearer once we think of an example together. And then that bottom layer is mental modes, which I think is a fairly clunky term, but don't get hung up on the sort of title. But it refers to the beliefs, the assumptions, the values, the morals, which sort of allow that structure to keep functioning. So actually a lot of the work that I do is based on this level. But I would say that the majority of international development work is in the first two, sometimes three. Very little happens down at this fourth level. You know, usually because it's very long term, being able to sort of shift the way that a society thinks about a particular issue takes a long time. Whereas maybe the first few bits and bobs up at the top are more immediate. We can see impact with that maybe a bit quicker. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can move to this editing version. Can anybody unmute yourself or drop in the chat box? We need like a social or environmental problem. We'll try, if possible, we'll try and do a fairly simple one, so that we can go through this together. But does anyone want to recommend something that we could use? Floods in Mumbai. Okay, brilliant. So events. The event, what happened, what do we see, is obviously a flood. So I'll get us started. The first thing that we notice, there's a problem, is that we see something happening kind of in front of us. It's observable. We're walking down the road, and what do we see? A flood. Great. Patterns and trends. What could the pattern and trend be around this? Any ideas? Okay, so poor drainage system would actually come under structures. Patterns and trends, exactly, Emma, could be something that occurs regularly. So it could be something like research shows us that Mumbai is flooding annually, and it could show us that those floods are getting worse, for example. Ooh. The structures that lead to that, absolutely, there was a point around poor drainage. So that could be, that's a structural issue. It could also be things like, you know, the government aren't investing. I'm making this up, I don't know, but the government aren't investing in better drainage, for example. But you could go on and on here. There could be absolutely loads. I'm just reading the chat. Negligence, climate change, absolutely, you could go on and on. These are the kind of big overarching structures that are leading to this flood. The mental modes, now this is harder, I think. Any ideas what the mental modes could be that are sustaining these structures, that are leading to these patterns, which is causing the flood that we see in front of us? So mental modes being the assumptions, beliefs and values that people hold, that uphold the system, that leads to the patterns. Yeah, absolutely. It could be that governments aren't interested. Government corruption, for example. When it comes to climate change, oh, you could go on forever, but I guess climate change, there can be, you know, the value of wealth and consumption. The idea that we want more and more and more and more, regardless of the kind of limitations of the world in which we live, and that is causing, you know, catastrophic environmental damage. Brilliant. Yeah, so hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of the various stages. I'll do one more for you, just to make sure that we're all clear. Sometimes these, it can be quite confusing. So I could use the example of cyclist deaths on roads. So I live in London, very high level of cyclist deaths. That could be the event. The pattern and trend could be that, you know, more and more people are dying on a particular stretch of road in London. The structure could be that there's no cycle path. It could be dangerous driving. It could be that people aren't wearing sort of protective helmets. The mental mode, so that could be that, you know, cars are considered a status symbol. The idea that, you know, cars actually rule the road and that it's not safe. It could be about the belief that cyclists are taking liberties on the road, that they're not sort of cycling safely, and so, you know, it's their own fault. So we could go on, and you could do this for loads and loads of issues, well, all issues, but quite often, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of what we work on in international development looks at the events. So we look at the immediate flood, we look at the patterns and trends. Okay, yeah, we can see that there's more and more flooding, so we're going to sort out the drainage system. But what we don't do is go to that step below, or at least we don't do it often, which means that we might sort out that drainage system, but we're going to have to sort out another drainage system a couple of years down the line, because if these bottom mental modes haven't changed, the root of the problem is still going to be there. So I guess what I'm trying to show in terms of, you know, what's our role in change is that the world is really interconnected, and that change is not a linear process. So it's not, you know, we see an event, we sort it out, done. There's a very kind of deep level of ways that change needs to come about in order to ensure that people and planet are thriving. And you might be somebody who goes into research, goes into a think tank, for example, and tries to identify those patterns and trends. Government do this a lot, for example. You might be somebody who is about immediate aid, that event portion up at the top, who is much more about alleviating immediate suffering. You might be someone who, I mean, structure is a huge category. You might be doing that. I guess a lot of the time this is where engineering will sit. You might be somebody who's working directly on changing a particular structure to sort of affect events, or you might be down here in this mental modes category. And quite often this is where you find the cultural sector. So thinking about, you know, how people think and act, and how does that kind of implement and have an effect on all of these different layers. So I wanted to talk about that in terms of, you know, international development is great, but it's almost like a tip of an iceberg in terms of the way that change comes about. And so I'd encourage you to think about those different steps in your own work, as well as thinking about, you know, sort of future careers that you might be interested in. Okay. I'm afraid I've done an absolutely terrible job at keeping track of time. Could one of my other hosts tell me how long I have left?
You've got 15 minutes.
Great. Okay, so we're going to go into discussion groups for sort of 10 minutes so that we can talk about these questions. So I said I'd try to bring it back to universities at the end. And I mentioned that, you know, we're not specifically talking about volunteering abroad in this session, but there's lots of overlaps, which I hope you've been able to identify. But I'd love you to have an opportunity now to sort of break out into groups for 10 minutes, have a think about these questions and how you might go about answering them if somebody said that question or said that statement to you whilst you were back on your campus. And we'll have sort of 5 minutes to feedback at the end. So if anyone in each of those individual groups wants to jot down any sort of, you know, life-changing thoughts that people have, please do, and so you can share back in 10 minutes time. That would be great. You know, have a productive conversation about ways that you might talk about some of this content back on your campuses. Does anyone have any kind of reflections that they'd like to share with everyone? You can unmute yourselves or type in the chat box if you'd prefer.
We didn't have any staff there, so we spent a few minutes trying to figure out what we're talking about. But we did come over a few things of sort of how that sort of sense of volunteering actually sort of has an impact, and sort of analysing that from a student and from someone who actually considered going and doing that. And one of the points that we came up with was who's actually getting the most out of that. Is fundamentally going there, so as a young professional, as a student, you're still going there to learn. So are you getting more out of it, or are the people who you're supposed to be helping getting something out of that? And also we covered perhaps it's probably more important for that area to have maybe the local skills and these supposed engineers coming in with the skills to take more of a backseat on that, and to be more about developing the local skills and the local education to have these solutions put in place, as opposed to let's come across and it's all about the teach them how to fish type thing of let's install a solution, as opposed to let's teach them how to do the solution or how that would work, and analysing, we have this solution, is it relevant to the specific area we're installing it in and the people there? I think that covers most of the points we made. I'm not sure we were entirely on topic. That's
okay. No, that's great. That sounds like a really fruitful discussion, and yeah, I think you've hit on some really good points there. I remember hearing about an international development organisation, I won't name names, that built a school this was in a fairly rural village in Nepal, and couldn't understand why the kind of Nepalese families weren't then sending their children to that school. And they'd done no consultation locally. There'd been no kind of, you know, understanding about the geography of the local area and you know, what needs existed, did they want a school, etc. And they then later realised that they built a school on a sort of really ancient and sacred religious ground. And so, understandably, the local community were really angry and were not sending their children to the school. And that was an international development organisation that had, UN funding, etc. And so international volunteering projects do sort of do cause damage like that, very frequently, unfortunately, just because they're not embedded in the local communities. Definitely not as much as a INGO, but obviously not as much as people that live there and know what needs they have. Brilliant, thank you very much, that was really good. Does anyone have any? I think we've probably got another couple of reflections if people want to, and then I'm going to be handing over to Emma.
I think on that note as well, the interesting thing about earlier, you shared that Google Docs with the words and things, and often what we associate with development projects is a project that's not the same as what we would do in our own countries, not necessarily the exact physical doing, but the processes. Absolutely. We don't necessarily follow the exact same processes. Yeah. And there's a lot of shortcuts, and it's deemed to be acceptable because there's volunteering or there's lack of resources already. But it's really important to follow those processes. You wouldn't build a school in the UK without a consultation. You wouldn't design a highways route without a consultation. You wouldn't think to have to build roads without of any operation maintenance in the future, and to have the skill set to be able to do that. So when it comes to these projects, it needs to be more strategic, and it's not a question of necessarily volunteering or not volunteering. It's about how to be a part of it effectively, and to create the necessary impact and to work with the local communities. So
put so brilliantly. Absolutely, I completely agree. And I think the premise of international volunteering at the moment, as it currently works, tends to not set you up to think in that way, because the framing is very much around, do you want a life-changing experience? Do you want to help a poor community, etc.? And that's as far as it goes. It doesn't tend to introduce you to these really broad and really important questions about process and about strategy and things like that, which is a shame. Not all international volunteering projects, some do, and that's good. I'm not blanket against international volunteering, but I think 90% of the time it could be made much better. Brilliant, thank you so much for engaging. As I said, this is like tip of the iceberg stuff. You could do an entire PhD on the sort of ethics around international volunteering, and you could go off on lots of different tangents looking at the specifics of engineering or the specifics of various other components of the international development sector. But thank you so much for allowing me to chat through some of that stuff with you today, and asking questions and being engaged. I'm going to be handing over to Emma, but I'm going to stick around in case you have questions or want to talk about anything further, and I'm very happy for the team to circulate my email address and things if anyone wants to chat further. But over to you, Emma.
Thanks very much, Ruth, and thank you for kind of taking us through that workshop today. I'm sure it was really valuable to have a different lens on things as well, because often it's engineering first, but I think it was really useful to have the conversation today in the way that you kind of designed it. So a big thank you from us as well. So in terms of the last, I think we've got 9-ish minutes. So I just want to flag that if there's something sparked today, as Ruth mentioned, it's the tip of the iceberg, and there's a lot of resources out there in the world around kind of understanding engineering, its impact on human development, but also specifically in and around the development sector. So if anybody has any interest in that, we have compiled a handout, just signposting to some of the bits that you might want to read, watch, or listen to. to expand your understanding, but also potentially as part of your chapter activities or as part of your teaching as well. And the one on my screen is a really interesting one, which looks specifically at the role of engineers in the development sector. And it's kind of a practical guide that gives an overview of the ethical considerations when seeking to work in this sector. And it's kind of applicable to all engineers, even though the Institution of Structural Engineers is the one that published it. You know, it's very much applicable to all types of engineers and beyond. So that's one that we'd really recommend. And we've put together a list of others that hopefully has been circulated in the chat. That link as well to the handout from today. So I just want to do a quick touch on, you know, Engineers Without Borders in our past, because, you know, we've had international volunteering as part of our organisation in the past. So just want to quickly talk about, you know, the journey that we've gone to look at learning from those experiences, what our organisation learned, but also the people within it. And then kind of looking at our reflections over the kind of last 9 months and the work that we've been doing to kind of set ourselves up to look to the head. It might be useful for you guys to know this anyway, just if you're out and about talking about Engineers Without Borders, you know, you might meet people from different parts of our 15-year history or, you know, from other Engineers Without Borders as well. So it's useful to just have this kind of framing and context for you as you go out and have wider conversations. So it's worth noting, I think, at this point that Engineers Without Borders UK was previously known as an international development charity, but in recent years we have broadened that definition and the areas that we see the movement having influence. So it's really moved now towards this idea of global responsibility in engineering. And to explain that journey a little bit, I'm just going to have a whiz through time using some of our annual reviews by year. So on the screen, you've got like all the way through to kind of 2012, 2013. So the organisation founded at Cambridge University by a group of students in 2001, actually inspired by Parker Mitchell, who came over from Engineers Without Borders Canada on an internship. And the early years were kind of characterised by growth, energy, enthusiasm. A lot of people related to the cause. A lot of people weren't seeing this type of stuff around social and environmental context inside their engineering degree. So therefore kind of were very enthusiastic about having a space to kind of learn from others and meet other people who were also inspired by that concept. So that was the kind of early 2000s. At this point, we were predominantly run by engineers. We were predominantly run by volunteers. So it was a volunteer-led organisation up until 2008, where we had our first staff member. And then over time, you know, that energy, that enthusiasm was really growing. Had lots of different programs, lots of different ideas, and kind of quite a lot of experimentation about what we did. So. Side note, at around 2008, somebody in a chapter at the university I went to put together a A5 leaflet that was sent to me before I became a student at a university, and actually it wasn't the prettiest A5 leaflet. It was this kind of scrappy piece of paper, but it for me was very much like, okay, I've made the right decision with engineering, this is where I'm going. So yeah, just kudos to whoever was in that chapter who put together that leaflet. But yeah, that kind of piece around, there was a lot of people involved. We had lots of chapters at different universities and programs done by the volunteers as well. In 2015, there was a kind of tipping point, you know, we were volunteer led, and then there was kind of integration of more of a staff team as well, but also this kind of momentum behind the organisation and the growth. I would say it kind of reached a tipping point where this kind of became unsustainable, and many programs were cut as a result to allow the time for the organisation to pause, reflect, make strategic decisions about resource usage, but also the impact that we wanted to have and how we wanted to have it, and to make sure we're set up to do something responsible for the long term. So in 2016, we shifted to this new strategy that we're currently in, which is all about global responsibility and recognizing the impact that we have on those mental models that Ruth was speaking about by, you know, having student chapters and expanding what it means to be an engineer and changing the narrative and having it informative view as a people's education as well. So kind of understanding our influence in that space. And one thing I wanted to make sure I touch on today is with our international volunteering programme. So from 2002 to 2019, we ran an international volunteering programme where professional engineers would volunteer for 3, 6 or 12 months. We worked in collaboration with trusted partner organisations, often community-based or small-scale NGOs, and occasionally bigger ones too. And over that time, we volunteered, I think, around 200,000 hours of pro bono engineering services. And that programme was very much part of our start, and it continued through. But in 2011, we made the decision to pause that programme and stop it. Thus the projects that we obviously wanted to keep our existing commitments to partners that we were working with. So the projects formally ended in 2019. And just to make you all aware, we kind of stopped recruiting for that placements programme. We're looking and reflecting on, you know, what is the best path going forward, and really have taken the time, especially the last 9 months, to research what has happened in the past, what has happened in the past, what have we learned, and what are those lessons that we've gathered from those experiences that we've gained as an organisation and as a movement. So what we're going to be doing is kind of packaging them up into some lessons learned to share, to talk about the strengths, the failings, what we've learned, and reflecting that, so that I think that it would be useful for others to kind of know, and also just to spark a dialogue in this space. We are very proud of like our 15-year history and how we've grown to where we are today, but recognise that it's really important to have those conversations and continue to touch base on where exactly we are and where we're going. I'm excited to share that we've got a strategy development process happening the end of this year into next. And what that really means is it's a really good time to bring together all of the different voices in our wider movement to shape, you know, what is our kind of key priorities, our key aims going forward. So like when we talk about the organisation grew and evolved over time, that was thanks to insights, ideas, challenges, reflections from a whole host of people that shaped the movement to what we see today. So yeah, please do get involved in that. It's a really great opportunity to kind of shape and work together and brainstorm and work out, you know, what is our wider purpose and what does it look like post 2021. Here's a lovely visual from our 15th birthday last year, and in the middle is that kind of 15-year. So it's really about looking to the next 5, 10, 15 years and like what is our role going forward. Yeah, so that's kind of where we've got to. And the other thing I just wanted to signpost, it is in the further resources, but there's a really great series of changemaker videos on our website where we dive into the role of engineers, what people's experience has been in the past, what do we need from engineers in the future, etc. And I really encourage you to share them in your chapters, watch them yourselves. They're really interesting. I learned a lot from watching those, and kind of understanding, yeah, it's just a great kind of hearing different perspectives on global responsibility. So very much kind of advise you to kind of look at that, and as you go forward, that kind of being aware, thinking, learning, thinking, acting, reflecting. You've all seen this model before because we've been drumming it in every session, but that kind of piece around, you know, let's kind of go on this journey together. You can't get the right answers instantly. And I do fundamentally believe that together we can work together to transform teaching, signpost further opportunities for like study and deepening understanding for individuals in our movement, help design kind of chapter activities. I know that we're picking up on that later this week, and developing our next steps to evolve our movement. So that strategy development process I spoke about. In terms of next steps, just a quick reminder for the chapters, we've got our marketplace on Thursday morning UK time, and in the afternoon we've got our academic session as well. So our marketplace kind of picking up on all of the different things that we wanted to talk about, and with our chapters, they're currently on the screen just now, and with our academics kind of looking at the next step in the journey for planning ahead. But I'm conscious of time and just wanted to say a big thank you for Ruth to joining us today. And I think that, you know, we've only touched on this, you know, what is the role of engineers in the development sector, but also like the bigger question of what is the role of engineers in human development, and what role do we all play no matter where we end up. So yeah, that's a bit of a wrap up, but wanted to make sure there's time for any questions at this stage. Okay, brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you to you too. And yeah, if you do have any questions that come up, if it's something that kind of twigs in your brain later on, there's the Slack channel for our chapters and the academic forum as well for our academics. So if something comes to you later on, don't be afraid to reach out and kind of ask a query about it.
Yeah, thank you. I found very interesting both parts. The part of Ruth when she pushed us to think about the words we're going to use, especially now with the COVID situation. We may do more campaigns or online activities to really choose the correct words to include everybody. It was something very good to think about. And also I like the second part, which is more maybe for the future, because I really think we really need to be experienced to offer something to the countries abroad if we think to go there. In the meanwhile, we can focus on design and learn better and better from experienced professionals, and maybe available for collaboration and to teach us to do a quality check of what we have produced so far. So it's challenging and very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much for the feedback as well, Kara. It's really nice to hear, but also to see where you see it being useful going forward. So thanks very much for that. Just a reminder in the chat, there's the handout from today, and if there's no further questions, we'll probably wrap up today's session just in the interest of time. But a big thank you to everybody that's joined us for these sessions, which we've had academics and student chapter committee members together. This is unfortunately the last one of these sessions in building community leaders, but I'm sure that depending on your feedback, you know, I'm sure there'll be opportunities for that in the future, because I personally have thought that it's been really useful to have everybody in together. So thank you very much, and yeah, we look forward to seeing you on Thursday in respective sessions.